Thomas Carver died the way most people expected him. Too alone, bitter, and unforgiving. At least, that's what everyone said at the memorial service. His daughter Rachel stood by the cheap casket in a funeral home that smelled of synthetic flowers and old carpet, listening to distant relatives whisper about how he'd wasted his last years nursing a grudge. How he'd never let go of what her mother did. How sad it was that a man could carry anger like that all the way to his grave. Even Rachel believed it. She'd seen the tightness in his jaw whenever someone mentioned her mother's name. She'd watched him live in that small apartment above the hardware store for 15 years, working 60-hour weeks, while her mother rebuilt her life 3 states away, with a new husband, a new house, a life that looked nothing like the wreckage she'd left behind. Her father never spoke of her, never asked about her, never acknowledged that she existed. Beyond the monthly child support checks, he never missed not once. Not even when the factory laid him off, and he had to take work as a night janitor to make ends meet. The world saw Thomas Carver as a man consumed by resentment. A man who chose bitterness over healing. A man who couldn't forgive. They were wrong. But no one knew that yet. 3 days after the funeral, Rachel returned to her father's apartment to begin the grim work of sorting through his life. The place was exactly as she remembered, clean but sparse. Everything functional, nothing decorative, except a single photograph of Rachel at her high school graduation. No pictures of her mother, no wedding photos. Nothing. She found it in the back of his desk drawer, beneath years of tax returns and utility bills. A sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, with her mother's name written across the front in her father's careful handwriting. The postmark was dated August 2000, 90 months after the divorce was finalized. It had never been mailed. Rachel held it up to the window, her hands trembling. Inside, she could see the shadow of folded pages, dense with writing. Her father had kept this for 15 years, hidden, unread by anyone but him. She didn't open it, not yet, because something in her already knew this envelope held a truth that would change everything she thought. She understood about her father's silence. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Tales of Injustice. This is where the stories that don't fit into headlines are told. Thomas Carver was the kind of man people felt sorry for without actually helping. You could see it in the way neighbors nodded at him in the grocery store parking lot, polite, careful not to linger long enough that conversation might require actual engagement. You could hear it in the tone his brother used when talking about him at family gatherings, that particular mixture of pity and judgment reserved for people who've let life defeat them. "Tom's doing fine," he'd say, in a voice that meant the opposite. Still working at the store. Still in that same apartment. The narrative about Thomas Carver had been written 15 years ago, the day Linda walked out, and nothing he did afterward seemed capable of revising it. He was the man who got left, the husband who wasn't enough, the one who came home early from a business trip and found his wife Eskar in a hotel parking lot, her phone going straight to voicemail, the truth waiting for him like a lit fuse. People remembered how he'd looked in the months after, thin, gray, moving through the world like someone trying not to take up space. They remembered how he'd stopped coming to the community barbecues, how he had declined invitations to his old poker group, how he'd shown up to his daughter's 16th birthday party, and left before the cake was served, because Linda's new boyfriend was there, comfortable and smiling, acting like he belonged. What people remembered most, though, was his silence. Thomas never spoke badly about Linda. Not once. Not even when she took half of everything in the divorce, including the house his father had helped them buy. Not even when she moved to Arizona with the man she'd been seeing, the orthodontist with the vacation home in Seattle. Thomas signed the papers, paid his lawyer, and went back to work at the hardware store his family had owned for 40 years. But silence, people decided, was just another form of anger, a more insidious kind. His co-workers at Carver and Son Hardware read his quietness as bitterness. When Linda's name came up and, in a town of 8,000 people, it came up, Thomas would change the subject, or find something that needed his attention in the back room. He never defended her, but he never condemned her either, and people interpreted that blank space however their own experiences dictated. Most saw resentment, rage too deep for words, the kind of wound that never heals, because the injured party won't let it. "He's never gotten over it," said Diane from the church auxiliary, who'd known both Thomas and Linda since they were teenagers. "You can see it in his eyes. That man is still carrying that betrayal like a stone." His own brother believed it. Tom's problem, Mark told anyone who'd listen, is that he can't forgive. Never could. Even as a kid. "You wronged him once. That was it. Done." Mark said this with the certainty of someone who'd decided long ago that understanding his brother was unworth the effort it would require. Even Rachel, Thomas's daughter, believed the story everyone told. She'd been 14 when her parents divorced, old enough to understand betrayal but too young to understand complexity. She'd watched her father shrink into himself, watch him trade their Comfortable 4-bedroom house for a two-room apartment above the hardware store. Watched him work open to close 6 days a week while her mother seemed to blossom in the Arizona sun, posting photos on Facebook of hiking trips, and wine tastings, and sunset dinners on restaurant patios. Rachel loved her father, but she also resented him for his inability to move on, for the way his pain became a silent weight she had to carry every time she visited. She'd invite him to dinner, and he'd come, punctual and polite, bringing flowers for her table, and asking questions about her job, her apartment, her life, but there was always something absent in him. Some essential part that had been removed and never replaced. She assumed that missing piece was shaped exactly like her mother. You should try dating again, she had suggested once, carefully, when she was 23, and thought she understood how healing worked. Thomas had looked at her with something like amusement. I'm fine, sweetheart. Dad, it's been 9 years. I know how long it's been. That was the end of the conversation. Rachel left that night certain her father would die alone, poisoned by pride and unprocessed grief, and there was nothing she could do about it. The town watched Thomas Carver grow older in his sparse apartment, working long hours for modest pay, living a life scrubbed clean of joy or companionship or hope. They saw a cautionary tale. A man who'd chosen to remain a victim. Someone who'd let one woman's betrayal define the entire second half of his life. At his memorial service, person after person stood and said some version of the same thing. Tom was a good man, but he never recovered from what Linda did. Such a shame. He deserved better if only he'd been able to forgive and move forward. The irony would have broken him if he'd been alive to hear it, because Thomas Carver had forgiven Linda completely. He'd done it with a thoroughness and intention that most people never achieve in their entire lives. He'd forgiven her, sacrificed for her, and protected her in ways no one knew, and he'd written it all down in a letter he never sent. Thomas and Linda had married young, the way people did in small towns in the early 90s. When staying felt safer than leaving. They were 22, both working entry-level jobs. Thomas learning the hardware business from his father, Linda answering phones at the county clerk's office. The wedding was modest, held in a Methodist church with a reception in a fellowship hall where Linda's mother had made all the food herself. For 16 years, it looked like enough. They had Rachel. They bought the house on Maple Street with the big backyard and the porch swing. Thomas took over the hardware store when his father retired. Linda went back to school part-time, got her real estate license, started selling houses with a nervous energy that Thomas found endearing. She was good at it, better than she'd expected. She liked the independence, the commission checks, the way clients trusted her. Thomas was proud of her. He said so often, in the plain way he said everything. You're doing real well, Lynn. And he meant it. He didn't notice, or chose not to notice, the way she'd started coming home later, the way her phone was always faced on the counter, the way she seemed to be looking past him towards some horizon he couldn't see. The affair started in the spring of 2008, though Thomas wouldn't know that until much later. Linda met Davichun at an open house at Piridantis, relocating from Phoenix, looking for property with land, someone cultured and ambitious, and utterly unlike the life she'd been living. It began as conversation, then coffee, then something neither of them named until it was too late to pretend it was innocent. When Thomas found out, it wasn't through confession or confrontation. It was a Tuesday in June. He had driven home early from a supplier meeting in Columbus, pulling into the Comfort Inn parking lot off Route 34 to return a call, and there was Linda's Honda Civic parked near the side entrance. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes, waiting to be wrong. When she emerged with David Chunaman, Thomas had never seen but somehow immediately understood her hand on his arm. Laughing at something he'd said, Thomas felt something inside him go quiet and still. Edrabaum, he didn't call her. He made dinner for Rachel, helped her with her algebra homework, and went to bed before Linda came home with an excuse about a late showing that he did on Challenge. The confrontation, when it finally happened 3 days later, was brief and without drama. Thomas showed Linda the hotel receipt he'd found in her car. She'd been careless, or perhaps some part of her wanted to be caught. She didn't deny it. She cried, said she was sorry, said she didn't know how it happened, said all the things people say when they've already made their choice, but need the other person to be the one who ends it. Do you love him? Thomas asked. Linda looked at him with something like relief. I don't know. Maybe. I think I might. Thomas nodded. Then you should go. She'd expected a fight. Tears, rage, pleading, something that matched the magnitude of what she'd done. His calm felt like indifference, and indifference felt like permission. Within a week, she'd moved into David's rental house. Within a month, they'd filed for divorce. The terms were standard for Ohio. Linda got half the equity in the house and the business, half the retirement accounts, and Thomas agreed to both alimony and child support until Rachel turned 18. His lawyer argued he was being too generous, that Linda's infidelity should matter, but Thomas signed everything without negotiation. What people expected was bitterness, anger, some visible sign that Thomas was wounded. Linda expected it too. She braced herself for his resentment at every custody exchange, every court date, every interaction. But Thomas was only ever polite, distant, careful. He asked how she was. He asked if she needed anything. He never once mentioned David or the affair, or what she'd cost him. Linda found his composure unsettling. Then it felt like judgment, like he was taking the moral high ground by refusing to engage. She told friends that Thomas's silence was typical, that he'd always been emotionally unavailable, that this was why their marriage had failed in the first place. She convinced herself that his quietness was proof she'd been right to leave. Rachel watched her parents navigate the aftermath, with the helpless confusion of a teenager trying to assign blame. Her mother seemed happier, lighter, full of plans and possibilities. Her father seemed absent, going through motions, performing the role of parent without fully inhabiting it. When Rachel turned 16 and Linda wanted to bring David to the birthday party, Thomas had agreed immediately. "You're sure?" Linda had asked, suspicious of his reasonableness. "It's Rachel's day. She should have everyone there who matters to her." But when the day came and Thomas saw David in his home-to-home, he had to sell to pay Linda her share, standing in the kitchen where Thomas had made years of family breakfasts, his arm casually around Linda's waist. Thomas had excused himself quietly and left. Rachel found him later, sitting in his truck in the driveway, staring at nothing. "Dad, I'm fine, honey. Just needed some air." She'd seen his hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, and decided her mother had been right. Her father couldn't let go. He was trapped in his pain, and it was ruining him. None of them knew the truth. That Thomas had already let go. That he'd made a choice, the week after the divorce was finalized, a choice that would cost him everything, and give Linda the freedom to start over without the weight of what she'd done. A choice he'd documented carefully in a letter he would never send, because the whole point was that she would never know. The injustice didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated in small, cutting moments that Thomas absorbed without protest, each one adding weight to a burden he carried in silence. It started at the hardware store. Carver and Son had been a fixture on Main Street for 53 years. The kind of place where farmers came for fence posts and young couples came for their first toolkits. Thomas knew every customer by name, remembered what projects they were working on, extended credit when times were tight. But after the divorce, something shifted in the way people looked at him. They pitied him. And pity, Thomas discovered, is just contempt with better manners. Men who'd known him for years started treating him like he was fragile. They'd lower their voices when talking about their wives, as if happiness was something that might wound him. Women stopped asking him to church socials or community events, deciding without asking that he'd prefer to be left alone. His presence became a reminder of failure, of the unpredictability of marriage, of all the ways a life could go wrong. Mark, his brother, took a different approach. He became convinced that Thomas needed intervention, management, saving from himself. He showed up at the store, unannounced, with advice Thomas hadn't requested. "You need to fight for your share of the business valuation. Tom, Linda's lawyer, is robbing you blind. It's fair, Mark. Fair. She cheated on you, and you're giving her half of Dad's legacy." Thomas had looked at his brother with tired patience. "It's half hers. She worked here too, kept the books for 12 years. You're being a doormat." Mark said it with disgust, as if Thomas's reasonableness was a character flaw worse than Linda's infidelity. The judgment spread to family gatherings. At Thanksgiving, that first year, Linda's absence was a presence of its own. Thomas's mother, grief-stricken by the divorce, kept touching his hand and saying, "You'll find someone better, honey," as if Thomas was the one who needed replacing. His cousins exchanged loaded glances when he arrived alone, their sympathy so thick it was suffocating. When Linda moved to Arizona with David 3 months later, the town's narrative solidified. She got to start over a new city, new man, new life. Thomas got to stay behind and embody loss. People saw Facebook posts about desert sunsets and weekend getaways, and concluded that she'd escaped a marriage that had been suffocating her. They saw Thomas working 70-hour weeks at a store that could barely afford to pay him a manager's salary, and concluded that he was punishing himself with work because he could unprocess his emotions like a healthy adult. The hardware store itself became part of his punishment. The divorce settlement required Thomas to buy out Linda's half of the business, $127,000, paid over 5 years. It was technically fair, but it was also devastating. The store's profit margins were thin. Thomas had to take out a loan using the business as collateral, then work without drawing a real salary to make the payments. He let go of both part-time employees. He started opening at 6 in the morning and closing at 8 at night, 7 days a week. His accountant, Helen Briggs, tried to reason with him. Tom, you need to restructure this. At this rate, you'll kill yourself before you pay her off. I'll manage. You're 52 years old, working 80-hour weeks for less than minimum wage. This isn't managing, this is self-destruction. Thomas had smiled at her. That same tired smile he gave everyone. I appreciate your concern, Helen. He sold a house on Maple Street because he had the divorce decree required it, and Linda needed her half of the equity for her fresh start in Arizona. Thomas found the apartment above the hardware store. 2 rooms that shared a bathroom with a rust stain in the tub he never quite managed to clean. He moved in with his clothes, his bed, and the photograph of Rachel at graduation. Everything else went to storage or Goodwill. Rachel visited once and cried when she saw where he was living. Dad, you don't have to live like this. It's fine. I'm close to work. It's not fine. Mom got the money from the house. She got her share of the business. She's living in a house with a pool, and you're in a room that smells like paint thinner. Thomas had looked at his daughter with something like gentleness. Your mother needed a fresh start. She got one. I'm happy for her. Rachel had stared at him, disbelieving. You're happy for her? Dad, she destroyed you. But Thomas said nothing, and Rachel left that day more frustrated than sad, convinced her father's forgiveness was just another name for weakness. The town watched Thomas Carver work himself to exhaustion, live in poverty, and decline every offer of help or companionship. They watched him wire child support payments every month without fail, even when it meant he ate ramen for dinner. They watched him attend Rachel's college graduation, sitting in the back row while Linda and David sat up front, and they shook their heads at his stubbornness. He's chosen to be bitter, people said. He's made himself a martyr. The truth, the real, devastating truth, was that Thomas had chosen the opposite. He'd chosen to absorb every consequence of Linda's decision so that she wouldn't have to. He'd chosen to let the world judge him so that she could be free of judgment. He'd chosen to look like the bitter ex-husband so that she could be the woman who'd escaped an unfulfilling marriage rather than the woman who'd destroyed a good man. And he'd done it knowing he'd never receive credit for any of it. That was the whole point. The sacrifice only worked if it remained invisible. But injustice, Thomas understood, isn't just about what happens to you. It's about what people decide you deserve. The humiliation of Thomas Carver's last years wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind that erodes dignity, one mundane moment at a time. The kind that happens when the world decides you're no longer worth its full attention. It was working the night shift as a janitor at the community college when the hardware store's income was enough to cover both the loan payments and basic survival. Thomas would close the store at 8, drive 20 minutes to the campus, and push a mop cart through empty hallways until 4 in the morning. He wore a dark blue uniform with his name stitched above the pocket, Thomas, or Tom, Jess, Carver. And he cleaned classrooms where students half his age left coffee cups and food wrappers, and casual messes that suggested they never had to think about who cleaned up after them. One night, he ran into Professor Hendricks, who'd bought roofing supplies from him just the week before. The man looked startled, then embarrassed, then overly friendly in that aggressive way people compensate when they encounter someone in a context that makes them uncomfortable. Tom, I didn't know you worked here. Just part-time, Thomas said, wringing out the mop. Well, good for you. Keeping busy. Professor Hendricks hurried past, and Thomas heard him on the phone minutes later in his office. You will never guess who is mopping floors here. Tom Carver? Yeah, the hardware store guy. I know, it's really sad. Thomas finished the hallway and moved to the next one. The humiliation was Rachel's careful phone calls, the ones where she tried to offer him money without making it obvious. Dad, I got a bonus at work. Let me take you out to dinner. My treat? Anywhere you want. That's kind, sweetheart. But I'm fine. Or I could help with if there's anything you need. The apartment or Rachel? His voice was gentle but firm. I'm okay. I promise. She'd hang up frustrated, and Thomas would sit in his apartment eating a dinner of rice and canned vegetables, listening to the pipes rattle in the walls, wondering if accepting her help would make her feel better, or just make both of them feel worse. The humiliation was running into Linda's mother at the grocery store. Barbara Martinez had been warm to him once, had called him mijo, and made him tamales at Christmas. Now she looked at him with a complex mixture of guilt and righteousness, the expression of someone who's decided that both parties in a divorce share blame equally, evidence be damned. Thomas, how are you? I'm well, Barbara. How's Linda? The question seemed to surprise her. She's good. Very happy. She and David are expecting their first grandchild. David's daughter is pregnant. That's wonderful. Please tell her. I'm happy for her. Barbara's eyes had narrowed slightly, searching his face for sarcasm or bitterness. Finding neither, she seemed almost disappointed. You should move on, Thomas. This. She gestured vaguely at his cart. His appearance, his existence, isn't healthy. Thomas had nodded politely and continued shopping. His cart contained store-brand pasta, the old bread, and the cheapest coffee the store carried. Barbara's contained organic vegetables and wine and fresh salmon. The distance between their carts felt like an indictment. The humiliation was the way his body began failing in small, manageable ways that he simply ignored. His back ached from the janitor work. His hands developed arthritis from years of manual labor in cheap apartments with poor heating. He developed a persistent cough that Helen Briggs noticed when he came to drop off the store's quarterly taxes. Tom, you sound terrible. Have you seen a doctor? It's just a cold. You've had just a cold for 3 months. You need to see someone. But doctors required insurance or cash, and Thomas had neither to spare. The store's insurance plan had been cancelled when he couldn't afford the premiums, and the free clinic had a 3-month waiting list. So Thomas took over the Kunta medicine and told himself it would pass, and it mostly did, until the next thing started hurting. The humiliation was his 50th birthday, which he spent alone in the apartment, eating Chinese takeout and watching a baseball game he didn't care about. Rachel had called, and Mark had called, and both had asked what he was doing to celebrate. Just taking it easy, he'd said, which was true in the saddest possible way. The humiliation was the way the town eventually stopped talking about him altogether. There's a particular kind of erasure that happens when someone's suffering becomes background noise. Too familiar to warrant comment. Thomas became part of the scenario, the man at the hardware store, working all the time, living small, stuck in the past. People stopped asking him how he was. They stopped inviting him to things. They stopped wondering if he'd ever be happy again because they'd already decided he wouldn't be. At the hardware store, younger customers started treating him like a relic. They'd ask for products using terminology from YouTube videos, and when Thomas suggested the traditional equivalent, they'd smile indulgently and check their phones, as if his decades of experience were quaint but irrelevant. The humiliation was watching Linda's life unfold on social media. Rachel was Facebook friends with her mother, and sometimes she'd share photos without thinking. Linda and David at a resort in Seattle. Linda hiking Red Rocks in Sedona. Linda at a wine tasting. Linda smiling in ways Thomas remembered from their early years together. She looked free. She looked happy. She looked like someone who'd made the right choice. Thomas never commented on the photos. He never liked them. He simply observed that the life he'd made possible for her through his silence, his sacrifice, his willingness to be seen as the bitter ex-husband was a good one. That was what mattered. The lowest point came on a Tuesday in November, 3 months before Thomas died. He'd been carrying a shipment of drywall sheets to the loading dock when his back finally gave out. He collapsed in the alley behind the store, unable pain radiating down his legs. He lay there for 20 minutes before he could pull himself up using a dumpster for leverage. He didn't call anyone. He drove himself to the emergency room, where they gave him muscle relaxers and a lecture about men his age trying to do physical labor without help. That night, sitting in his apartment with an ice pack on his lower back, Thomas had taken out the letter he'd written 15 years ago. He did this sometimes, when the weight of everything felt particularly heavy. He'd read his own words, remember why he'd made the choices he'd made, and find in that remembering a kind of peace that no one else could give him. The letter reminded him that his humiliation had meaning, that his suffering was not pointless, that dignity is about how the world sees you as about how you see yourself when no one is watching. Thomas folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and put it back in the drawer beneath the tax returns. He never once considered mailing it. Rachel had been putting off clearing out her father's apartment for 2 weeks. Every time she thought about facing those 2 small rooms, the narrow bed with its threadbare comforter, the kitchenette, with its single plate and single fork in the drying rack, the overwhelming absence of a life fully lived, something in her chest tightened, and she found an excuse to delay. But the landlord needed the space, and there was no one else to do it. Mark had offered to help, then cancelled twice, and Rachel realized she'd prefer to do this alone anyway. Her father's poverty felt like a private thing, something that shouldn't be witnessed by people who'd judged him without ever trying to understand. She arrived on a Saturday morning in late March with empty boxers and garbage bags, steel wool in her spine. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. The small television was still on the news channel he'd been watching. His reading glasses sat folded on the side table next to a library book about the history of the Ohio River Valley, a bookmark placed 3/4 through. Rachel moved through the rooms methodically, trying not to feel clothes into donation bags, kitchen items wrapped in newspaper, bills and documents sorted into a folder for the estate lawyer. She worked quickly, efficiently, breathing through her mouth so she wouldn't smell her father's soap, his coffee, the particular scent of him that still lingered. The desk was small, pushed against the window overlooking Main Street. Her father would have sat here paying bills, doing paperwork, looking down at the hardware store that had consumed so much of his life. Rachel opened the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, a roll of stamps, expired coupons he'd never used. The second drawer held instruction manuals for appliances he no longer owned. The bottom drawer stuck. Rachel pulled harder, and it jerked open with a screech of wood on wood. Tax returns, organized by year in manila folders. Utility bills, bundled with rubber bands. A warranty for a watch he bought in 1997. Rachel was about to close it when she saw the edge of the envelope, yellowed and formal, tucked beneath a folder labeled 2010 taxes. She pulled it out carefully. The paper was expensive, the kind you'd buy for important correspondence, not everyday use. Her mother's name was written across the front and her father's careful printing. Linda Marie Carver, not Linda Chun, which was her legal name now. Carver, the name she'd given up. Rachel turned it over. The seal was intact, never opened. The back flap had a return address printed in the corner: Thomas Carver, 412 Main Street, Apartment 2, Millbrook, Ohio. The postmark read August 14, 2009. Rachel's breath caught. August 2009. 2 months after the divorce was finalized. 15 years ago. She held the envelope up to the window. Sunlight illuminated the shadow of folded pages, inside multiple pages, densely written. This wasn't a short note. This was something substantial, intentional, composed with care. Her father had written to her mother, had addressed it, prepared it for mailing, and then had kept it, hidden in the back of a drawer, for 15 years, until he died. Rachel's hands were shaking. She sat down on the floor with her back against the desk, the envelope in her lap, her heart pounding in a way that felt like premonition. Every instinct told her that what was inside this envelope would change something fundamental, would rearrange the story she'd been telling herself about her father's life. She thought about calling her mother. She thought about calling Mark. She thought about putting it back in the drawer and pretending she'd never found it. Instead, she turned it over in her hands, studying the weight of it, the way her father had written each letter of her mother's name with precision, as if the act of writing it meant something, as if he'd been trying to get it exactly right. Rachel thought about the father she'd known, quiet, patient, perpetually alone. She thought about the bitterness everyone had assumed he carried, the resentment that had supposedly poisoned his last years. She thought about how he'd worked himself to exhaustion, lived in poverty, and never once spoke badly about the woman who'd left him. She thought about how everyone, including her, had decided they understood what his silence meant. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, heavier than paper should feel. It felt like evidence, like testimony, like a locked door she'd been standing in front of her entire adult life, without realizing there was something on the other side. Rachel's finger traced the edge of the seal. She could open it. She had every right. Her father was gone. There was no privacy left to protect. And yet something made her hesitate, the sense that once she knew what these pages contained, she couldn't unknow it. That the truth, whatever it was, would require something from her. Outside the window, Main Street moved through its Saturday routine. The hardware store below had a for lease sign in the window. Her father's life had already been dismantled, parceled out, erased, except for this. This envelope he'd kept for 15 years. This truth he had written down and never shared. Rachel slid her finger under the seal and opened it. The letter was written on lined notebook paper, the kind her father would have had at the hardware store, practical and without pretense. 4 pages, front and back, his handwriting smaller and more careful than usual, as if he'd been trying to fit something large into a limited space. Rachel unfolded it slowly. The date at the top confirmed what the postmark had told her. August 14th, 2009. She began to read. Dear Linda, I'm writing this knowing I'll never send it. That's important for you to understand. If you're somehow reading this, I don't want anything from you. Not acknowledgement, not gratitude, not even understanding. I'm writing this down because some truths need to exist somewhere, even if only on paper in a drawer. I forgive you. Rachel stopped breathing. She read the sentence again, then again. Her father's words, written 2 months after the divorce, hidden for 15 years. I forgive you. I forgave you the day I found out, actually. I know that's hard to believe. I know how I must have seemed in those final months, distant, cold, unreachable. But I wasn't angry then. I was trying to figure out how to let you go without making you carry the weight of what you did done. Here is what I understood that day I saw your car at the hotel. You'd been unhappy for a long time, and I'd failed to see it. Or maybe I'd seen it and hadn't known what to do about it. I'm not good with words, the way some men are. I'm not romantic or exciting. I'm steady, and I'm faithful, and I'm present. And for 16 years, I thought that was enough. It wasn't. That's not your fault. That's just true. Rachel's eyes blurred. She wiped them with the back of her hand, and continued. You needed something I couldn't give you. David could. I don't hate him for that. I don't hate you for finding it. I hate that I wasn't enough. But that's different than hating you. So I made a decision. I decided that if you were going to start over, you needed to really start over. Not carrying guilt, not carrying debt, not carrying the burden of having destroyed a good man, because I'm not destroyed, Lynn. I'm just different now. The next section made Rachel's chest physically hurt. The settlement we agreed to, I want you to know it wasn't just fair. It was strategic. My lawyer told me I was being foolish, that Ohio law didn't require me to give you half of everything, especially given the circumstances. But I needed you to have enough to truly leave. Enough to feel secure. Enough that you'd never have to look back and see me struggling and feel responsible. The house money gave you the down payment for your place in Arizona. The business buyout gave you income stability while you established yourself there. The alimony supplemented what you made until your real estate career took off. One structured all of it deliberately. Not because the court required it, because you required it. Rachel felt something rupture in her understanding of the past 15 years. I know how this sounds, like I'm some kind of martyr or saint. I'm not. I did this because I still loved you. And real love means wanting someone to be happy, even when their happiness doesn't include you. Especially then. Here is what I need you to never know. I took out a loan to buy your share of the business. The payments consumed everything. I had to let employees go, work every day myself, take night work at the college to make ends meet. I sold the house and moved into that apartment above the store. I stopped spending money on anything that wasn't survival or my debt to you. I need you to never know this because if you knew, you'd feel terrible. You'd offer to give money back, or you'd feel guilty every time you posted a picture from a vacation or bought something nice for yourself. Your freedom only works if it's complete, if you never have to think about what it costs me. Rachel was crying now, reading through tears that blurred the ink. I need everyone to think I'm bitter and stuck and unforgiving. I need Mark to think I'm being stubborn. I need the town to pity me. I need Rachel to be frustrated with my inability to move on. Because if any of them knew the truth, they'd tell you. And if you knew, your fresh start would be contaminated with guilt, and this whole thing would be for nothing. That's why I'm writing this down and not sending it. Because someday I'll be gone, and maybe someone will find this. And maybe they'll understand that the way I lived after you left wasn't about bitterness. It was about love. The kind that doesn't ask for credit. You get to be happy, Lynn. You get to live without shame. You get to tell people our marriage just didn't work out, that we grew apart, that sometimes people aren't compatible. You get to believe that I'm fine, that I moved on in my own way, that we both survived this. That's my gift to you. Not forgiveness. That is freedomina. That was expensive, but worth it. The letter ended simply. Be well, be happy, forget me, kindly. Thomas Rachel sat on the floor of her father's empty apartment, holding the letter and shaking hands, and finally understood the full weight of what her father had carried alone. The sacrifice wasn't just financial, it was reputational, emotional, relational. He'd chosen to be misunderstood by everyone who loved him, so that the woman who'd left him could be free. And he'd done it so thoroughly, so completely, that even his own daughter had believed the lie he'd built to protect her mother. Rachel read the letter 3 times before she could stand. Then she photographed every page with her phone, her hands still trembling, and carefully returned the original to its envelope. She sat in her car in the parking lot behind the hardware store for 20 minutes staring at nothing, her entire understanding of her childhood rearranging itself like a puzzle she'd been assembling with half the pieces upside down. Then she called her mother. Rachel, honey, I'm just sitting down to brunch with. I found a letter Dad wrote to you from 2009. He never sent it. The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. Then, what kind of letter? The kind you need to read in person. Are you coming to Ohio for the estate stuff? I wasn't planning to, but you need to come. Tomorrow if you can. Linda arrived on Monday, leaving David in Arizona with an excuse about needing closure. She met Rachel at a coffee shop on the edge of town, somewhere they wouldn't be recognized, somewhere the conversation could happen without witnesses. Rachel slid the envelope across the table without preamble. Linda picked it up, saw her old name in Thomas's handwriting, and something in her face changed. Where did you find this? In his desk? He kept it for 15 years. Linda opened it with the careful movements of someone defusing a bomb. Rachel watched her mother's face as she watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her expression shift from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like physical pain. It took Linda 10 minutes to read all 4 pages. When she finished, she set the letter down and stared at it as if it might rearrange itself into something more bearable. "Oh, God." Her voice was barely audible. "Oh, God, Thomas." Rachel said nothing. There was nothing to say that the letter hadn't already said. Linda stopped, started again. "He let everyone think he was bitter. He let me think." She pressed her hands to her face. "I told people the marriage had been unfulfilling. I told people I'd felt trapped. I told myself he'd been emotionally distant, and that's why she couldn't finish." "You built a life on the story that leaving him was justified," Rachel said quietly. "And he knew you needed that story, so he protected it." Linda looked at her daughter with something like horror. "The business buyout. The alimony. I thought the lawyers said it was standard. I thought I was entitled to it." "You are entitled to it legally, but Dad structured it to be more than legal. He structured it to be enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough for you to never look back." Linda's hands were shaking. "The apartment, his apartment. I saw photos when you were clearing it out. I thought he was just being stubborn, living like that, refusing to move on. He was paying you back for half a business, while working as a janitor, so you could buy a house with a pool." The words landed like a physical blow. Linda stood abruptly, walked to the window, her back to Rachel. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "I posted pictures of vacations, of the house, of my life with David. And he saw them. He saw all of them, and he never turned around. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he ask me to give money back? Why didn't he let me help? Because then you'd feel guilty, and guilt would ruin the freedom he'd bought you." Linda sat back down heavily. What kind of person does that? What kind of man sacrifices everything so his ex-wife can be happy? The kind who loved you more than he needed you to know he loved you. Transformation in Linda's face was complete now. The careful narrative she'd maintained for 15 years that she'd left a marriage that wasn't working, that Thomas had been fine in his own way, that they'd both moved on collapsed entirely. In its place was the unbearable truth. She'd been loved with a generosity she'd never recognized, never thanked, never honored. Everyone thought he was bitter, Linda whispered. His family. The town. You. He wanted us to think that. It was part of the gift. Linda's tears came then, full and wrenching. Not the delicate tears of someone seeking comfort, but the ugly, gasping tears of someone encountering a moral debt they can never repay. Rachel watched her mother cry, and felt something complicated, not satisfaction, not cruelty, but a kind of witnessing. Her father's truth was finally visible. The weight he'd carried alone was finally shared. When Linda could speak again, she said, "What do I do with this? How do I can't go back and thank him. I can't apologize. I can't give the money back. I can't undo any of it." "No," Rachel agreed. "You can't. So what do I do?" Rachel thought about her father working 70-hour weeks, eating ramen, sleeping in a room that smelled like paint thinner. She thought about the way he'd smiled at her when she'd worried about him, that gentle, deflecting smile that had always frustrated her because she misread his resignation when it was actually peace. "You live with it," Rachel said finally. "You carry the knowledge of what he did. You tell people the truth about him. You make sure no one remembers Thomas Carver as bitter or stuck or unforgiving. You make sure they know he was the most generous person they never understood." Linda nodded, still crying. "I'll tell everyone. David, my mother, anyone who ever said anything about Thomas being..." She stopped. "God, I have to tell David." "Yes," Rachel said. "You do?" The moral inversion was complete. Linda had walked into the coffee shop as the woman who'd escaped an unfulfilling marriage. She left as the woman who'd been loved more profoundly than she deserved, and had never known it until it was too late to say thank you. There was no revenge in this. No confrontation. No dramatic scene where Thomas got to point out her just a quiet rearrangement of truth, settling into its proper place, rendering judgment without violence. Justice, Rachel understood, doesn't always look like vindication. Sometimes it looks like this: the slow, devastating recognition of what you failed to see when it mattered most. Rachel kept the letter, not the original that she gave to her mother, who folded it carefully into her purse with the reverence of someone carrying a sacred text. But Rachel kept the photographs on her phone, and sometimes, when the world felt cynical or transactional or mean, she'd read her father's words again and remember that extraordinary love is quiet and asks for nothing. Linda did what she'd promised. She told David first, sitting him down in their living room with the letter in her hands, watching his face change as he understood that the life they'd built together had been subsidized by the man he'd replaced. David, to his credit, didn't minimize it. He simply sighed. He must have loved you very much. And Linda had nodded, unable to speak. She told her mother, who wept and said she'd misjudged Thomas terribly and wished she could tell him so. She told Thomas's brother Mark, who went silent on the phone for a long time before saying, "That sounds like Tom. He never needed credit for anything." Word spread through Millbrook, the way truth always does in small towns, slowly at first, then all at once. The narrative that had calcified around Thomas Carver for 15 years began to crack and reform. People remembered moments differently now. The way he'd worked so hard wasn't stubbornness, it was sacrifice. The way he'd stayed silent wasn't bitterness, it was protection. The way he'd lived small was unfailure, was the cost of ensuring someone else could live large. At the hardware store, which Rachel decided not to sell, she hung a photograph of her father behind the counter. Not the sad, tired man from his final years, but a picture from 1995, young and smiling, standing in front of Carver and Son with his arm around Rachel as a child. Underneath, she mounted a small plaque. Thomas Carver, 1956 to 2024. He carried more than anyone knew. Customers asked about it. Rachel told them. Some cried. Some stood quietly, absorbing the story. Some went home and called people they'd been resenting and tried, however imperfectly, to forgive. Linda came back to Ohio twice that year. Once for a memorial service. Rachel organized a real one this time, where people spoke about Thomas with accuracy instead of pity. Linda stood at the front of the room and read the letter aloud, her voice breaking multiple times, and when she finished, the silence was profound. The second time was in November. She came alone. Drove to the cemetery, where Thomas was buried in a plain grave. She'd offered to upgrade, but Rachel had declined. Linda sat on the grass beside the headstone for an hour, talking to a man who couldn't hear her, saying everything she should have said when he was alive. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't ask. I am sorry I posted those pictures and complained about things and took everything you gave me like it was owed instead of earned." She pressed her palm against the cold stone. "You deserved better than me, Thomas. You always did." Before she left, she placed something at the base of the headstone. A check for $127,000, made out to Rachel, with a note. "For the business, what he paid for my freedom. Please use it however he would have wanted." Rachel deposited the check and used the money to establish the Thomas Carver Memorial Scholarship at Millbrook High School. It went to students who worked multiple jobs to support their families, who carried invisible burdens with grace, who understood that dignity isn't loud. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl whose mother had left when she was 12. She worked evenings at a nursing home and weekends at a restaurant, kept a 3.8 GPA, and never complained. When Rachel handed her the scholarship check, the girl cried and said, "I didn't think anyone noticed." "Someone always notices," Rachel told her. "Sometimes they just don't say it out loud." Years later, Rachel would think about her father's letter and understand that its power was unjust in what it revealed, but in what it asked of her. Thomas Carver had lived his life according to a principle most people give lip service to but few embody. That love is about what you get in return. That sacrifice isn't transactional. That the highest form of generosity is the kind that remains invisible until you're gone. He'd forgiven completely, given extravagantly, and endured silently, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to bear misunderstanding for the sake of someone else's peace. Rachel tried to live like that. She failed often, because it's almost impossibly hard. But she tried. And sometimes when she got it right, when she absorbed a small injustice without retaliating, when she gave without needing credit, when she loved someone enough to let them misunderstand her, she felt her father's presence, felt the legacy of his quiet strength moving through her. The letter never left her phone. On hard days, she'd read the last line again. "Be well. Be happy. Forget me, kindly." But no one who knew the truth could forget Thomas Carver, or the lesson his life taught, that dignity isn't about being understood, it's about understanding what matters more than being understood. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is love someone so thoroughly that they never have to know how much it costs you. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people who were judged too quickly, forgotten too easily, then subscribe to Tales of Injustice, because there are many stories like this, and most of them are never told.